um, our impromptu podcast on insider threat. Who owns the risk? Got a great group of fellas here today to talk about insider risk, insider threat. My name's Tim Schnurr. I work for a company called Lease Trust, which is based out of New York City, and we help mostly financial services, but some law firms as well, implement insider threat and trade secret controls. We're going to go around the horn here, and like I said, thanks for joining us, and we'll jump right into the content. Ryan, you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. I'm excited to be here. This panel is amazing. Some brilliant minds sitting around the microphone sharing their insights. Excited about this. So Ryan Rambo, 26 years in the United States Army, 16 years doing strategic counterintelligence, retired in December of 2016 and went straight corporate and built corporate counterintelligence programs in two multi-billion-dollar corporations. After doing that for about 8 or 9 years, I broke out and joined a team at IXN Solutions, where I'm now serving as the Executive Vice President for Commercial Offerings. We're a corporate counterintelligence company delivering counterintelligence solutions to both government and the corporate space. Thanks for having me.
Glad you can make it. Kenneth, you want to go?
Sure. Definitely honored to be, in a room with the giants, as they say. So I did about 8 years active duty Army. So held a couple different roles from intel to PSYOP and civil affairs. After leaving the Army, like Ryan, I didn't serve as long as he did, but I jumped right into corporate and worked with a number of consulting companies, building out insider risk and counter intel programs for a lot of oil and gas and pharmaceutical, in some, state, local, and federal agencies. Currently, I opened my own firm about 4 or 5 years ago called SPM Advisors. We work with a lot of small and mid-sized businesses, doing a lot of proactive and reactive engagements. We've got a heavy focus as well on insider risk. So that's where we are today. And we're based out of Central Virginia, but work with organizations globally.
Awesome. Last but not least, Barry, thanks for joining.
Hey, thanks, Tim. Glad to be here. So Barry Madetzke, background similar to Ryan's. I did 20 years Army. My background was primarily Army intelligence and counterintelligence when they'd let me do it. So I made the jump about 3 years to the corporate sector, had a soft landing with Mandiant, where I was a senior consultant and helped Fortune 500, 100 companies build their and design insider risk programs. My last gig here was at Principal Financial Group, where I was an insider risk engineer, and not ready to announce who I'm going to be working for here soon, but had a little bit of movement last week, so I will be working with a new company here, and I'll be the lead for investigations and insider risk at a emerging company. So pretty excited about that. But again, thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad you could join. It's great panel here. So I'll throw a couple questions out there. First off, I want to say most of our audience here today is mixed, right? We've got some IP attorneys, some CISOs, some insider risk and counterintelligence practitioners, maybe some external counsel and general counsel as well in-house. So really the gamut. And threw this out there: who owns the risk when it comes to insider threat? I think we'll focus a little bit more on the malicious side. Ryan and I joke about this often. Insider threat is a terrible term because was it somebody clicking on a phishing link, or was it something, was the intent a lot more malicious and intentional, we'll call it. So, but like I said, we'll really focused on that. But I wanted to throw it out there. What are the most common cases you're seeing, guys, with your years of experience here at, in the corporate world? What are the common cases? Like, what are the most damaging things you've seen out there? Kenneth, you want to go first?
Sure. It's hard to really pinpoint the most damaging. I know some big things in the news lately involve, North Korea and, foreign actors that are exploiting, the remote hiring practices and things like that. So I've worked with some organizations that got caught, in the early processes of those schemes. But I guess, from a non-nation state perspective, some of the most damaging are, organizations that lose source code, that are developing proprietary solutions, especially in the age of artificial intelligence. So, programmers and engineers seem to come and go, and organizations just lack the right visibility and controls around that. So, I've seen some pretty damaging operations happen because of that, where somebody like a lead engineer leaves, they take their source code and bring it to a competitor that's paying the right amount. So I've seen some operations have to slow down pretty significantly. And then other things that I'm seeing are I think this is a more common scenario where you see people leaving with client lists and bringing that to competitors. So you have a lot of client churn from their original organization, and companies are trying to figure out what's happening, right? Because they assume that client relations were good. They have key partners that leave, and then subsequently they see their user base churning as well.
Yeah, that I'm glad you mentioned that. Shawnee Delaney, I'm sure we all know, who's quite an influencer in the insider threat space. She posted something today about, marketing. I didn't know my marketing materials were, a trade secret. And of course they are, right? Like you're not publishing your files on a daily basis. So as an employee, I can't just simply leave with them. Maybe I don't know that. Maybe I do know that. And maybe that's, I think certainly a large aspect of insider risk. But Barry, any good war stories, examples?
I think I'll talk in terms of like the most common. Kenneth already mentioned a couple of them. I think it is hard to like say what's the most damaging, because it might, it depends, right? It depends on the industry you're in. It depends on how much you're taking in, and then there's always that question of like how can you anticipate how much you're actually losing if somebody steals your IP or your source code, like Ken was talking about. But the common ones are those leavers and joiners when they first come into your company. Whether they're joining, you want to trust but verify. There's always that standpoint, and I'll probably cross into some of your other questions by answering this question too. But I think a lot of it too is, I'd be remiss like to say like the theft of IP or what a company deems as critical information. And I kind of say it that way because there is always, it's one of your questions, like, who owns the risk? That's what we're primarily talking about. But it's like oftentimes there's not a common understanding or an agreement of what the actual critical information is or what the crown jewels are, even though we have business processes that guide, that should guide us. But I think sometimes, again, we start to get this narrow focus of like when we start to hear these problem sets of, if it's counterintelligence or it's insider threat, we get this narrow visor. I think it's any problem we tend to think about, because as humans, we try to break it down. We try to break down this enormous problem to something that's more understandable. So it starts to, like, I think, pigeonhole or stovepipe our thinking. So, I think it's a big thing to say of like, identifying that early of what your common use cases are. And it's going to be different for every company. But I think, again, the most common ones I've seen so far have been like leavers joining, and then just leavers joiners, and then I think overall just like theft of intellectual property, or what some companies might deem as critical information.
Yeah, that's certainly our focus with clients. Theft of intellectual property. We don't usually have international sabotage or espionage as well. So it's that folks. I'm glad you mentioned that about kind of the use cases and scope though, as well. So Ryan, you want to answer that first question, or you want to kind of jump into this next one? I think scoping and how you get like almost a corporate, what's your corporate mission or what's your corporate purpose as a counterintelligence or insider threat team. So.
Well, I want to go back and thank Barry for that good warrant officer answer that he gave. That it depends. That is everything that a warrant officer always says. So thank you, Barry. I appreciate you for that. But I would like to answer that first question real quick because, I'd say 85 to 90%, and, all statistics are made up on the spot, but 85 to 90% of all of my insider threat cases were the non-malicious type. I mean, they were the ones that were the employees who were well-intentioned, just didn't understand the policies, the SOPs. They didn't understand like end user agreements and acceptable use policies with devices, and they do something stupid with it. I would say that's the vast majority of the cases that I ran as I hate this term, insider threat professional or counterintelligence professional in industry. Now, the 10%, I love, we probably just came out of the whole evaluation and bonus season. I love that time of year because that's prime time for our field. And what we typically see is like entire teams that would leave. And you're like, wow, why are they leaving? Well, they're going to leave to start their own company. They've identified a gap in what services or product that you provide. They have a solution. They're taking their bonus as seed money to go create their own company and compete against you. And that's a wonderful thing. I've seen it probably about 5 or 10 times over the last, 6 or 7 years. And it's always an interesting case. So I would say that that's a big one. I would also say that anytime a person leaves an organization, whether they're being laid off, terminated, or just walking out the door, they're taking institutional knowledge with them. And so it may not be intellectual property, it may not be the crown jewels, but they're going to walk into whoever they go to next and say, well, this is how they're doing. And you can't wipe that hard drive, because that hard drive's in their brain, and they're going to tell you, we tried it this way, it didn't work, so we went this direction. Or this is the way that we're approaching our clients at our previous company. These were the clients. So I think that was probably the vast majority and mostly hugely impactful. Now, about 6 or 7 years ago, I did a case study, and we looked at all of the employees that had left the organization, voluntary termination, got laid off, whatever. And we just looked back 12 months and said, well, how many of those joined our direct competitors? And what we found was about 19% had walked out of the building and went straight to a competitor and took a promotion, a pay raise, and were working for the direct competitor. Now think about that, 20%. If that's 1,000 of your employees that left that year, you have 200 that are now working with your direct competitor. That's impactful. And it doesn't raise to the level of making a news media. I think it's not like Meta, who's actively trying to recruit OpenAI, engineers or anything, but it's significantly impactful to an organization.
It's funny you mentioned that because I never really thought about it, and I think we can actually throw a little fuel on that fire, Ryan. Because think about it: if you worked at a company and they were innovative, and you're going to a competitor, starting a competitor, who's the most likely to get funding, right? You're like, oh, where did I just work at? I worked at OpenAI, or I worked at, as we're seeing these trade secret cases kind of hit the press. I think one of them, it was Palantir, OpenAI. There was like $100 million of funding, right, and seed funding. So, the opportunity's there, right, for the person looking for that window. So.
Yeah, if you're an investor, the first thing you're going to do is go to LinkedIn and see where they worked. I mean, your resume's right there. It's like, oh, you've got all the bona fides. You're an established professional, and man, I can't wait to throw you money. You're going to make me a ton of money.
Absolutely. So next question I had, kind of sent this to you the other day. Do you think insider risk is underassessed in a business impact assessment, or kind of the risk analysis of the company? Obviously, you guys have worked in companies that understand the need, understand the value of practitioners like yourself. But typically in most companies, do you think insider risk is undervalued? And I guess maybe why, right? You want to start with that one, Barry?
Yeah, I'll take a shot. I would say yes would be the easy way to start out, but I think it's undervalued. Kind of what I alluded to earlier is I don't think that there's maybe a common understanding of like what actually insider risk is or insider threat is across like the multiple business units or an agreement on what it is. Because like a lot of corporations that I've seen so far, everybody has like maybe a different emphasis or how they're viewing the problem, and then based on where the program resides can influence that a lot. So if it's just an insider risk or even an insider threat program, sometimes we play on those names too, but I think like sometimes the names give like a different perspective. So I've seen like where insider risk is they truly do look at it as a risk issue, whereas a threat program, even though it sounds scary and sometimes that's part of like why companies will name it a risk because they think it's like it lands softer. But from what I've seen is sometimes like, well, the threat perspective becomes more of like, well, I'm going to start to be more I'm going to take action to what threats I'm seeing rather than like that proactive approach. So that's why I kind of think sometimes you could say it's underassessed just because it's getting reported in different ways. Unless you have this great program and you're in this symbiotic relationship where everybody sings kumbaya and understands things at the same level, then maybe it's not. But I would say it's still probably underreported even for whatever reason. Again, it could be because of like, a company doesn't want to be embarrassed or whatnot. Right. But you could say that about external threat actors too, from just a pure cyber defensive perspective. So yeah, I think though it's underreported primarily again because like there's just not a common understanding across an organization, or like it's reported in multiple areas, so therefore it doesn't like kind of get counted all the time. Because you could have like some programs you might have like a physical security office that's looking at workplace violence or indicators of workplace violence, and and in my mind as a counterintelligence agent, it's all the same. It's still risk. It's risk across the organization. So yeah, I think it's under.
Yeah, I actually wrote an article. Verizon Breach Report is the biggest cybersecurity kind of like bellwether index of breaches, and there is in the latest version they don't mention insider at all, not once.
Yeah.
They call it a privilege misuse or something like that.
Yep. Yeah. So
the numbers
that's
are
a good
very
one.
small. So
yeah,
I think from an external perspective, it's hard for you to pound the table as a CISO or whoever we'll ask the question, who owns the risk, and say, this is happening outside of the company. Besides what you're seeing, I think in the courtroom.
Yeah, there was another piece too that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention is like, is it undervalued? Are programs undervalued? I don't know that. Again, I don't think they're necessarily undervalued. They could be, but again, I think it's more of like I think organizations value an insider threat, insider risk program, or a counterintelligence program, but it's like again to get to the understanding of like what value does this program bring to me. I think it goes to again just kind of back to what I was kind of harping on there a little bit is like it's that common understanding, and it's like it's that's probably like one of the hardest things I've seen to get to is like the common understanding across an organization on what insider threat is, to like define it. It's not the sexy part of the program because it doesn't bring you like a lot of immediate value, but it's so important. Laying like that the policies and the procedures and kind of getting the organizational momentum and brain trust to all kind of agree on what it means to that organization.
Kenneth, you're fairly active with several different clients and companies. What are your, I guess, what's your scope? Like, what are you there for? Are you there for workplace violence? Are you there for IP protection, or, clicking on phishing links, or?
Yeah, I mean, Ryan, Barry, they've hit on a lot of different aspects. I mean, working in a corporate world, yes, a large percentage are those clickers. But in regards to scope, the way I personally approach it is, I think this is the same for cybersecurity or any other effort to buy investment, right? To get people interested. So I try to find the key stakeholders in different departments, whether it's physical security or open source team, if they have one, IT, HR, legal. It's just super, super critical. I believe everybody would agree to get everybody in the same room. I've done workshops before where, we were brought in by a cybersecurity team because they experienced an incident, and they're like, all right, our leadership is asking us, how do we detect this moving forward? How do we stop it? And then sometimes, we try to broach the conversation of, what really matters to the organization. We try to educate them and say, is it just data? Is it just, making sure they're not clicking on links? Or, are we worried about the holistic, for lack of better terms, view, right? Are we worried about executive protection? Are we worried about, travel, where people are going, right, to foreign countries? And so, yeah, like I think what everybody kind of struggles with is getting everybody at the same table, headed in the same direction. Because my personal opinion and viewpoint, what I'm seeing in my part of the world is, we definitely have greater success when, everybody from these different disciplines can come together and say, you know what, I never thought about it like that, or I didn't see how something that started online could spill into the physical world, right? Maybe to touch on the United Healthcare incident last year with the executive that was removed from his position. I don't know how to say this on a podcast. I think everybody understands the situation where he was assassinated, basically. So, sometimes there are online indicators that can lead to, physical acts. So that's what we're observing in our work.
Ryan, you got a lot to go with there. A lot of under assessment of risk, scope. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we've talked about this before, right, Tim? I mean, we've mentioned how I think it's absolutely undervalued. Your counterintelligence and insider threat, insider risk program starts before the employee gets hired. But how many times are, these security professionals brought into the pre-hire situation where they're reviewing resumes or they're reviewing background checks and that sort of thing? I mean, because by the time the employee comes into the organization, they're in the trust tree, right? They're immediately onboarded. They're given access to the entire keys to the kingdom and told to go to work, right? They're now a trusted member. But what do we really know about them? We've done a few records checks. We've had 4 or 5 people that have conducted interviews. Most of the time it's performance-based. It's not related to security at all. And so, so we have an unknown element entering into the organization. Now, will we ever do that from a corporate standpoint if we're going into a merger or acquisition or taking on a new client or offering services to somebody? We would never do that. We would do our due diligence. I mean, that's the big term, right? I mean, we're reducing our risk by doing due diligence. But I don't think that we do the same thing if we come to our employees, especially during the pre-hire and onboarding thing. Now, that all goes out the window once an employee comes into the organization. Now they can navigate their way through, and of course we can get alerts and that sort of thing, but that's a reactive state. It's not a proactive state. And it puts us into a really bad security posture when we look at it this way. So I think externally, we're probably doing a pretty good job, even from a cybersecurity standpoint, of protecting ourselves from cybersecurity hacks, ransomware attacks, and all of the other things that we've seen in industry over the last 5 to 10 years. But from an insider threat, counterintelligence perspective, I don't think that we're not paying enough attention to it. It's burning people almost on the daily. So I'm glad you raised that topic because I think it's an important part.
So I attended a big insider threat conference last month down in DC, and there was, pretty good panel, some Fortune 500 companies up there that lead the insider teams. And that was my question. Like, how do you show value? Like, what are your metrics? That's my favorite question to ask at a conference. Like, what are your metrics? Like, what are your KPIs? They had, these are different companies. One was in finance, one was in defense. So obviously it may change a little bit in terms of their scope and their way to show value, but they got up and said, it's not cases closed. It's not kind of like, detected insider activity. It's the best answer, I think, was really like, risk identification in the actual like risk management process, right? Like, so them finding another 50 million, another 100 million of risk, right, that we didn't know was there, which I think is actually probably the right way to go about it, Ryan, right? Like the fact that if something bad happens, like what's the material loss of somebody taking the source code, as Kenneth or Barry mentioned, right? So just that ability to kind of like show your value, I think, in the risk management process. So I was kind of, working backwards from that, but I was just curious to see, what you guys have experienced as well. So
yeah, so I love that, because I had a very senior executive in a company look me dead in the face and said, "What's the score here with your program, Ryan?" I was like, "Excuse me?" He's like, "A scorecard. Man, I want a scorecard. Where's my scoreboard at where I can tell if I'm winning or losing?" And I gave him the biggest deer in the headlights look that he's probably ever seen in his whole life, because nobody's ever posed it to me like. But I read a book by Jim McConnell, and I'll give him a shout out, because probably the best book I've ever seen on metrics, on security metrics. And it's one that I think everybody should have on their shelves, because there's ways that we can come up with a numerator and a denominator and have statistics that actually mean something. And for your example on investigations, you're right. Cases closed, cases open, none of that really matters. But cases open, cases closed that led to some personnel action, that matters. And so now we can say, hey, I had 100 cases this year. 70 of them led to it's just a remediation at the local level, but 30% of those led to some kind of personnel action, whether they were put on a PIP, if they were terminated, or whatever, but that's a statistic that jumps off the page, and leaders can make a decision based off of those numbers. 30%, that's pretty huge. And so maybe there's a training aspect to it. Maybe there's a policy enhancement that goes along with it. But it's those types of things, those types of metrics that really move the needle whenever it comes to these programs.
Awesome. Yeah. So I'll let you guys counter as well. Are there metrics, Kenneth and Barry? Some of the metrics I work with clients specifically, because I like to focus on the data governance side. And I don't know if you guys are involved in that, like with data classification and, clearly, you guys are from military backgrounds, so you've classified data in different schemas and whatnot. But just the movement of that, Ryan, over time, like how much of the total landscape is classified, or how is that, what about the percentage breakdown? Like, is there more market share in proprietary or private regulated, right? So that's one metric, which, it sounds like it isn't important, but AI readiness and data governance and analytics, like if you don't have your data structured or tagged or whatnot, like I think you're probably at a lost cause by now. So,
and I think there's another side of that from the insider threat perspective. It's good. You've got the data classified. Have you classified your personnel? Have you given them the security clearance? Like, hey, you're restricted to this level of classification. You're restricted to that. You have more privilege than the next. And I think if we don't work both sides of those coins, we're doing ourselves a disservice.
Yeah, I like to say what you just mentioned was scoping, like role-based access control, right? Which is the access, and then I just sort of, I call it exfiltration, right? So like, what's the next step, like from a cybersecurity perspective? But Kenneth, any thought on metrics? Like, obviously, you probably have set up some reporting for the work you've done.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the organization, but some things that seem to resonate in my experience with leadership of different organizations, regardless of industry, is sometimes the money saved, right? So if we're looking at metrics, it's good to show cases, it's good to show detections, mitigations in the process, but in many times we can use this. Our findings will have reviews saying, okay, well, we saw, this gentleman or this lady doing this activity. Do you have a policy around this? So there are a lot of process improvements that we discover where an organization, it may not have been explicitly known or thought of, right? Especially with artificial intelligence, maybe marketing or HR should not be processing somebody's resume through ChatGPT or whatever. So we find a lot of opportunity for education, process improvements with, the different teams, opportunities for fine tuning, their strategies and policies. So strategies in regards to, you have data sprawl, right? Especially post COVID. Organizations had to invest in a lot of cloud first tools to continue work. And it's hard to say no, you shouldn't do that. But, it's time to wrap our arms around that and figure out, how do we reduce risk, right? The role-based access, zero trust, making sure that we can identify this, and then team members know, you can't just go use your personal OneDrive, you can't go use your, Google Drive. These are the approved list of technologies and solutions you can use. If this doesn't work for X project, you need to put in a request for something else. And then we also, to wrap this up, sometimes if a company is still has a presence on premise, we help them identify new projects where, instead of spending millions of dollars trying to secure data everywhere, we can consolidate a lot of the critical data on certain servers or locations, and put the right layers of controls around it.
Definitely. Barry, any good metrics? What are...
Man, there was a lot of good. Yeah, there's a lot of good topics that we just hit around that I think are tied
my
to.
wheels were spinning. I was thinking of like data retention.
Yeah, it's like how do I answer that and stay focused? So, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I might I like the idea behind metrics, from a risk perspective. I think that's probably the greatest value. Again, even though it's not what traditionally we might think about as metrics, because I know from a cybersecurity perspective, those, cases opens, cases closed, mean time to.
Those are we hear those conferences all the time. We're spitting acronyms at non-technical people. But it's not like cybersecurity is doing a great job at this. So.
Yeah. So it's to me, I think we get paid to help decision makers make decisions. So I think we have to get better at hey, what is this metric? What decision is it informing? And to me, it's that sometimes doesn't get asked enough. It's left to the counterintelligence folks or somebody else to come up with that metric, and that's fine. We can use our experience to help inform that, but we really need to have the conversations with the C-suite and the decision makers, or even the shareholders, if you want to get them involved, because what's important to them, and then that should formulate what our metrics are, and it was mentioned to me it should tie back into our risk register. As an organization, every organization has a risk register, but it's a lot of times I see there's that gap on where we get, again, we get these stovepipes, and then the information isn't shared across the enterprise again to come back to, because it's kind of that question of the overall question of who owns the risk. Well, who owns the risk is the enterprise risk folks, or they should, from at least the risk register perspective in my mind. It should reside there. It shouldn't be different, because we've already put a lot of mental gymnastics into creating this and to identify the threats anyways. So, again, since I think insider risk and insider threat has become so prevalent, we're getting to a different depth, and we're looking at the risks from a different perspective now a little bit. So I think we need to go back to those risk registers too, to make sure that they're updated, and then it ties back, because I think that can lead to more momentum, in a perfect world across the organization, to get people more in aligned. And that's why I always kind of go back to the enterprise risk. It's not going to be the end all be all, but at least it starts to align everybody in a similar path, and at least at least we're all in the same boat rowing. We might be rowing our oars in different directions a little bit, but at least we're in the same boat now. But like the other decisions too, is like, if we're seeing X amount of different violations to a policy, like Kenneth was talking about, well, then we might have to look deeper at, like, are we whitelisting? Are we blocking? Are we really saying, like, what is our authorized software that we can use? Being very focused on allowing exceptions. That's one thing that for organizations it can get out of hand, to where it's like the exception becomes the rule rather than just like, hey, this is supposed to be a one-off thing. Like, it should actually support a business process to even be considered. And it's like that, well, we really need to press hard on that too, as like all security professionals. And what's best for the organization to press hard on that is, like, it can't just be because it's easy. We're going to get caught if we go with that mentality. But the other thing that was mentioned too was, again, like, I think when we look at where that risk is, what metrics are informing our path. Like, I go back to like my counterintelligence days about like placement and access. In insider risk, it comes down to a lot about that. So, like, identifying, where is the greatest risk and who are the individuals that have access to that information, starting from like the foundation, and then having that inform, some of the policy scope of the program. And then that should align hopefully with, like, our metrics should be kind of based on that focus, is the way I see it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's, as you said, that it depends, or Ryan might have said it, but so I'll jump into, I guess, we named this podcast "Who Owned the Risk," and I think it obviously depends, right? When it comes to insider threat, I like to pull out the negligence side of things. Employees just assume they're not going to, like, but if they're untrained and they're, even if they are trained, like, they're going to make mistakes. So on the negligence side, I call it unintended pen testing. That's just it's the way of saying things. It's the same thing. Like, if you're a developer, an app developer, like, the users are going to tell you where your errors are. But in terms of like some of the other vectors or some of the other attacks, in terms of data theft, who owns the risk, right? I mean, I think I struggle with this. Ryan, I don't know, you guys have been pretty successful at IXM. Kenneth, in your business, like, who's the buyer, right? Like, who's someone who's going to champion insider? I know you mentioned cross department, and we certainly need that, right? There's HR controls and legal controls, but ultimately, who's going to be the champion, or who's even going to be delegated, or the risk owner for insider threat? Ryan, I've seen you post on this before as well.
Yeah,
but it doesn't turn out to be that person. But
yeah, right. I have my personal opinions. I honestly, I know there's some danger in doing this, but I think it should rest in the legal department. That said, it depends, because it depends on who carries the biggest bat in a corporation. I've seen in some corporate structures, the CFO was the big person. I mean, he made all the decisions, and everybody else just went to the CFO and begged for, whatever, begged for permission. And other organizations, I've seen it where it's a executive vice president that's close to the CEO. They play golf on the weekends, and he carried the big stick in the corporation. So I think you have to identify who that person is, and then that's the person you have to sell the program to. And it's different for every program, but once you find them, they can move mountains, because they're the ones that have the ear of whoever the ultimate decision maker is within the organization. Now, if it was Ryan Rambo world and everything, went my way, I would say it would be at the legal department, because I think most cases are dispositioned at the legal department. So they're the ones ultimately responsible for defending the corporation from any litigation that may come out of an insider threat or insider risk perspective. And they're also the ones that usually serve as the prosecutor within a company whenever they say that person is out of here. Yeah, HR, make it happen. It's from a legal perspective. So for me, I would like to see it in the legal department. However, I think it really is personality driven across different organizations.
Kenneth, what's been your experience? Is it the biggest bat person? Is it someone just by accident, or I guess who's the champion?
No, this is definitely, I think my experiences and thoughts really align with Ryan's. Definitely personality of who holds the most political power. However, looking at insider risk as a practitioner, legal. In a lot of my experience, it's the legal department. And for a lot of the reasons Ryan listed, and I would like to also add, when an insider risk is identified, or however we want to term it, it's usually legal that the team has to go to seek guidance to make sure that investigations, counterintelligence investigations and such, are happening within the bounds of the law, which is even more the case with international organizations that have a multinational footprint, because privacy laws, employee laws, vary globally pretty significantly. So, for example, if you're doing an investigation that involves an employee in Europe, right? You've got the GDPR laws. A lot of those nations do not have background check. You can't usually do background checks on individuals there. So you're a bit limited in information gathering. So, but to answer the question, from my personal perspective and in practice with functioning, programs, it's legal where the buck stops for all the reasons listed above, with HR and people managers supporting, advising, and being part of the process overall.
Awesome. There's a couple comments in here, Ian and Dave Holder, but I'll come back to those. Thanks for posting on there. Barry, who owns the risk here?
I like the idea of legal in a perfect world. I would, the other one that I've seen very successful, but it's the legal arm of HR, and that's HR employee relations, whoever the legal expert is right there, because again, it's just that's ultimately, if you're going to prosecute or remove somebody from employment, that's where it has to go through too, to keep you on the up and up and safe if you're going to remove someone from employment. But, I think too, it's, there is a certain amount of this too, is who has the most political power, from a senior stakeholder perspective of the program, and who kind of is the senior leader. That's definitely what Ryan was talking about, who you need to sell the program to. That's huge in trying to get the whole organization moving in the right direction. I sometimes go back to, everybody's had their own experiences in the military on how efficient we are. Are we efficient? Are we not efficient? But, at least the chain of command helped out a lot with, from, even from an insider threat perspective, or any type of regulation that a commander had to follow, because you have a clear line there, and it's not so clear, in a corporate organization. So that's critical, because if you don't have the right stakeholder, your program's not going to have the focus it needs to, or the emphasis sometimes that it needs to help focus it.
Well, Barry, I love that you brought up employee relations. And so whenever we go in and establish a program, we want to have two partners at a minimum, and that's legal and employee relations. And we want them to have oversight and control, because legal is the prosecutor, and ER in many cases, they're the defense counsel. they're on the side of the employee, making sure that we're not crossing any lines and being abusive to the employee's rights. Now, one thing I would also say, another argument for the legal department owning this is that they typically own data classification as well. And they're the ones that, are tagging and making sure that information is tagged properly according to their classification level. So for me, I think it all makes sense. Now, I'd add one caveat to all of that is if you're going to put a team in the legal department, make sure that they have user level access to all cybersecurity tools so they could pull their own logs, they could do their own investigations, and keep those as discreet as possible so that we're not unintentionally damaging an employee's reputation or poisoning the well with their manager. It's all contained within that legal department for discretion purposes.
So coming back to these comments, Ian, appreciate it. His 2 cents on like the, onboarding. Offboarding is obviously the biggest risk in terms of, where the risk is coming from an insider perspective. Hold their comments. He'd love to see a collab in our mix of KPIs here that we've regurgitated. I guess the next question, now that we've said, the GC probably is the right person. Obviously, there's a cross department. You need a lot of help, right, in terms of cybersecurity controls and IT controls and HR controls and even compliance, right? The people who make sure that people are doing their training and things like that. What does that look like in reality? For a new program, Ryan, like you've just sold the GC and you've got them on board. And, I wanted to ask you about the motivation as well, but you kind of mentioned litigation. Not everyone's been burned, I guess, by a kind of like, competitor, like a Waymo Uber case, right? So, what are the next steps, right, from mobilizing people?
I think it's an education process at the ELT level, the executive leadership team level, to try to tear down the silos. And I think people fail to understand, as a intelligence or counterintelligence function or an insider threat function, we get tips and indicators from different silos. So the physical security silo, the cybersecurity silo, the HR silo, and there's crossover there. So making people aware of, hey, how impactful it is. Like, what'd you say? This employee tried to use their badge to gain access to this sensitive area and it triggered an alert. Maybe we should go take a look at the cybersecurity team and see what his cybersecurity logs are looking like. It's not a one-off incident. It's in the person trying to, increase their level of access to sensitive information. And so and then you go to the, HR department and say, what'd you say? They got passed over for promotion or didn't get the bonus they expected and they filed a complaint against their boss. Well, all of this stuff ties together. We're dealing with a person. And we get to see them from 9 to 5, and we have no idea what their life is like after they leave work or get off the network. Well, they may be dealing with all kinds of personal issues that, are relevant from a security standpoint in our company. And I think, going through that process of educating all of these key leaders and these key entities within the organization is usually the first step to building out a very solid insider threat or counterintelligence program.
Kenneth, how do you initiate things and get things going from almost a state of no program at all to full blown getting them going?
Yeah, I think the key word here is education. Getting everybody together, finding common ground like anything else. But I guess another term that I like to consider in these cases are champions. Identifying champions from these different key leadership teams, right? The employee relations, legal, governance, the different teams we've already mentioned. So educating, identifying who they should be, and that's usually somebody in the C-suite that I experience that handpicks different champions and notifies them. There's sometimes a breakdown initially of, we come in, we arrange these workshops and engagements, and we get in the room with the individuals and start asking them questions. They're kind of blindsided because they were not fully made aware. It was just one of those things, right? Like the military, you're voluntold. So it's educating, championing, and empowering these key stakeholders in each of their roles and helping them, equipping them with the knowledge and tools that they need to be successful. So that way they understand, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not HR, I'm a cyber guy, I'm an IT guy, or change management, but this is the specific role, the key skill sets, and knowledge that I bring to the table to make it all work. So that's, an approach that we take is building the different risk champions for each organization.
Do you have prescriptive controls for each of those silos for the people? You mentioned the champions. What are they?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So we do. We've got specific things most organizations can use. These different functional roles can do and provide and bring to the table. So, cybersecurity, we need these logs, or if you're a firewall guy or whatever it may be, we do come to the table with actionable things that they can do right away to create an impact. And then there are things as we iterate that they can continue to do and improve and, educate.
Barry, any thoughts? What are your...
Yeah, I think to kind of build on what everyone has said too is like there's normally especially when you're standing up a new program, you have to show like immediate impact, or there's this pressure to show value right away.
Honeymoon phase.
Yep. And that's important. It kind of goes to like one of the questions you were talking about is like, putting in, what was it? Putting in your like hardening or like thinking like detections focus. It's like, yeah, there's some low hanging fruit that we can do there that I think will make, get some immediate impact. But I think if you don't do that, like along with this idea of training, it's like, well, from a leadership perspective for the insider risk or insider threat program, we as professionals need to take the time and work with our leaders to exercise some tactical patience, like think about this more strategically to get the scoping of the program correct. And I think like, getting everybody to get into somewhat type of alignment, that's part of like, what might be in the background going on of like, that training that we're doing for executives or whatever has to be informed by that scoping plan. So if we can do that correctly and really get down to like the responsibilities and the roles and responsibilities for each of those key stakeholders that we say should be part of this program, aligning that, having our great framework that we already have laid out, and we can sell that and really, sell it and then get to that level of training on like, hey, justifying to our executives of this is the way that the program needs to look, or we think it needs to look. And then obviously you get some feedback from those key stakeholders there to make your subtle tweaks. But I think that's a key part of that, that training part of the program, that to bring everybody like more in alignment, that kind of gets missed because like it's like sometimes you make the problem so big, you're like looking at more of like trying to inform people on like what insider risk is rather than like what it should look like for our organization.
Yeah, that's tough. Barry or Ryan, you want to go one more time, and then we'll do kind of final.
Just one more thing too, and what I found is that initially standing up a program, it's a trust campaign. Because everybody's looking at you like, oh my God, what is this crazy person going to do to our employee base and to our managers and everything else? And you have to go around and sell yourself and say, hey, look, you can trust me. I mean, what we're going to do is above board, by establishing oversight and control with legal and ER, that adds another element to it that says, hey, I'm willing to have somebody watch over my shoulder to make sure that I'm not stepping on toes and breaking any laws. And so there's that aspect of it too, that I think goes along with tearing down silos and making friends and finding champions. It's building trust that you're not going to do something really extraordinary that's going to impact the organization in a negative way.
Yeah, I'm with Kenneth. On the education point, you can't just install something from zero and all this. It's like you put in DLP and you turn the dial all the way up. Like they're going to run you out of the building. But yeah, we're almost out of time. I could talk forever with you guys. final thoughts, like maybe one good tip for, best practice or control for, like I said, it's a mixed audience here today with general counsel and IP counsel and CISOs. So, Barry, what are, one closing tip for our audience?
I think one thing that that I didn't get to mention here that I found like particularly useful is, that problem of identifying critical assets or the crown jewels. If you're having a lot of trouble with doing that, again, we can revisit risk risk registers, but again, sometimes they can be very outdated. Sometimes they're great and they're updated, and you can use that. But I think to get the lay of the land is, looking at those key stakeholders. And what I've found successful or helpful is going to the business information security officers, because each of them kind of knows like the ins and outs of each of the businesses, and again, like where a lot of the risk or even like the immediate problems are. So getting input on those, on informing like your risk, and where you should at least initially focus, can do a lot for your organization.
Kenneth, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm going to take it a totally different direction to wrap up, considering the mixed audience we have of legal HR and IP lawyers. I think in the climate that we currently live in, with a lot of white collar jobs being displaced by artificial intelligence, I think if you look across social media, LinkedIn, I think one significant thing that we constantly overlook is we're great at detecting the bad, but I don't think we do as good of a job providing actual support uh, to employees, to team members. So I think there should be. I think it's also critical to incorporate, a real humanistic view of people. Right? It's a people problem. Technology is just a symptom, like cancer. So I think really investing in a meaningful approach. I'm not an HR guy, but trying to find a way to put the humanity back in our employment sector, and trying to find ways to help people through whatever they're going through. I know there are employee resource programs. I know we're getting at the top of the hour, but trying to find a way to meaningfully support employees, whether they're going to get transitioned out or not, instead of treating them like a disposable asset, for a lack of better terms. Investing in them as a human is, throughout the entire life cycle, can help mitigate a lot of the disgruntled employees. Going back to Ryan's, I think, earlier points about performance season and annual bonuses and such. So I think that's an area that could use some closer review.
Ryan. Yeah, I agree.
So
Yeah.
if you're questioning whether or not you need an insider threat program, I challenge you to run this test. On Monday morning at 10 o'clock in the morning, go into your DLP solution and pull a manual log. Pull a CSV file from Friday afternoon previous at 6 p.m. all the way to Monday morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, and manually go through those logs. You could do a pivot table, you can filter it, however you want to do it, and filter it and see how many sensitive documents are flowing out of your organization on Saturday and Sunday to a private email address or to a public email address. If you don't think you have an inside threat program, I think that's an enlightening moment, because people steal your, excuse my language, shit on the weekends. And so, especially if they're taking their laptops home. And so just run that check. Do it for 3 or 4 weeks in a row. And if you see data that's flowing out on Saturday and Sunday, think about having a counterintelligence team. Let us come in and do the job for you. I mean, that's what we're trained to do.
Yeah, I'll pile on that, Ryan, as well. So like, just look at your last 3 to 5 ex-employees and look at their last 3 days to a week, not even, right? Like last day, right? So I think you'll find plenty of spot check sample evidence there that you probably didn't want those files to end up at the competitor, or the competitor that he's co-founding with the other ex-employee and being funded millions. So, but we're out of time. This was awesome. Ryan, Kenneth, Barry, pleasure. Thanks for joining. And we'll hopefully do this again in the future.
Thank you, Tim. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
guys.
Great panel.